The monuments of Paris, the Eiffel Tower, the Palais de Chaillot, the Arc de Triomphe and Notre-Dame, all bring French history to life. So do the city's famous hotels, the Ritz, the Lutetia, the Meurice, and even the restaurant Maxime's. What secrets lie within their walls? This dazzling city was about to face the German invasion of the Second World War. Hitler wanted to crush Paris, but did he really want to destroy it?
The city was humiliated.
Was the City of Lights overcome by the darkness of Nazism? Did racism and anti-Semitism take over the French capital?
The swastika flag reigned over the city.
How did the people of Paris fight back?
The problem with the resistance in 1940 was that it didn't exist yet.
Did the Paris Opera and the Comédie Française submit to the invaders?
The resistance was born out of necessity.
After the fall of the greatest monuments, the Palais de Chaillot and Sacré-Cœur, who emerged from the shadows to take up the fight?
There are real memories of the resistance in Paris's great cultural institutions.
Long overshadowed by the broader story, we will reveal many small, overlooked actions, like when Grand Hotel servers lied to the Germans about the chandelier being about to fall to get them out of the main lobby.
And they believed it.
We will also examine how the insignificant space, like a school or a bookstore, played a vital role.
This bookstore was where secret underground meetings took place.
They had us meet in the basement, creating lots of propaganda.
Why were these stories concealed? We know about occupied Paris, but what about the Parisian resistance?
The entire nation was inspired by these exemplary lives.
Men and women joined forces in an attempt to defend their city and country.
Paris would become the capital of the resistance.
You're about to discover this forgotten story of the Parisian resistance.
Under all circumstances, Paris is still Paris.
Paris was already fascinating in the interwar period. It was a glorious city where the victory of World War I was celebrated in 1918. The Popular Front had given communists a place in cultural life, and in 1937, the Exposition Internationale saw the construction of the Palais de Chaillot.
It's important to put all of this in context. In the interwar period, Paris was really the city of lights. People from all over the world came here to have a good time.
The Paris Opera was as prestigious as it had been in the 19th century. France's artistic identity was heavily intertwined with the Palais Garnier.
The Comédie Française was enjoying a brilliant phase. Large attendances meant that it was very successful financially, as revenues were on the rise.
Les Invalides in 1939 was the military museum and the location of Napoleon's tomb.
It was symbolic of the spirit of defense.
At the dawn of the Second World War, Maxime's was probably Paris's most famous restaurant, which consequently made it the most famous restaurant in the world.
Just before the Second World War, the Palais de Chaillot was brand new. It would become a hotspot for Nazi entertainment. It was just the type of architecture the Führer liked.
But everything would change a few months later with the start of the war in 1939. The Nazis had conquered much of Europe. Now they set their sights on France and plotted their invasion. The Germans advanced through France quickly. Paris needed to prepare for the worst.
The French army's debacle forced its immediate surrender. It gave Paris to the Germans, and from then on, the city's greatest palaces and monuments belonged to the invaders.
The French were not expecting defeat in 1940. France was considered a powerful nation. At that time, the French army was said to be the best army in the world.
On June 11th, the capital was a free-for-all as the last children were evacuated. By June 13th, the Germans had spread to the suburbs.
On June 14th, when these perfectly well-dressed, strong, and very organized people marched down the street, everyone was simply flabbergasted.
That day, the Nazis became the masters of Paris.
Avenue Foch was named after one of the great victors of World War I, and yet that was where the German troops chose to enter Paris on June 14th, with a huge military parade just in front of the Arc de Triomphe.
When the Germans took over Paris, the Parisians, along with the rest of the French population, were absolutely traumatized.
The first signs of patriotism began to appear as soon as the Germans settled in. These famous images were taken on June 14, 1940, the day the Germans marched on Paris. While many men weep, this elderly lady seems to yell, "Long live France, long live France." In the distance, others stand disapprovingly with their arms crossed. Unease was widespread. So were the first hints of the resistance, subtle gestures that would evolve into something greater.
The first thing the Germans did when they got to Paris was to take over the Place de la Concorde. Next, they moved towards the Eiffel Tower.
And yet, the soldiers at the Eiffel Tower couldn't use the elevators. Someone had intentionally blocked them. They would have to use the stairs for the duration of the war. Even so, German flags sprang up throughout the city, proof the occupation had begun. The swastika now hung on the city's most symbolic monuments, the Eiffel Tower, the Grand Palais, the Arc de Triomphe, and the important hotels.
One morning they appeared, and then they were everywhere. The speed at which they took over proves that they were incredibly well prepared. In one day, they made themselves at home.
And of course, everything was filmed for use in German propaganda to show the swastika flag flying over Paris.
How would the occupying forces treat the capital they had conquered? As usual, the Germans took over the big hotels first, since they're designed to have ample reception space and have many rooms that can quickly be transformed into offices.
But above all, the hotels had telephone switchboards.
They took over Western Paris, where hotels were in larger numbers and wanted to enjoy Paris's luxuries. They set up their government's military headquarters at the Meurice, 228 Rue de Rivoli, in the heart of the capital. The palace was henceforth under their guard. The Abwehr, the counterintelligence agency, took the Lutetia. The German High Command took the Majestic on the Avenue Kléber, and the Ritz housed the aerial branch, the Luftwaffe, and became home base for any German dignitaries passing through Paris.
An American client once asked the director of the Ritz, Elmiger, "How did you know the Germans were coming?" And he said, "They made a reservation."
At midnight on June the 14th, the time changed to 1 a.m. Paris was now on German time, setting the clock to match Berlin. All seemed lost. Would France find a way to rise again? On June 17th, the new head of government, Marshal Pétain, asked the Germans for an armistice. It was signed on June 22nd near Compiègne. France was now officially divided into two, much to Hitler's delight, as he could count on France's collaboration in his quest to conquer Europe.
There's one excruciatingly humiliating image, which hurts me every time I see it. It's that of Hitler on the Trocadero, looking at the Eiffel Tower and Paris.
Hitler's visit to Paris felt like the proof of Germany's domination.
Hitler came with a few other men, notably his architect Albert Speer, who spoke of this visit as if it were a race. Between 6 and 8 a.m., Paris was deserted. And what did Hitler do? He visited all the greatest monuments: the Trocadero, the Eiffel Tower, the Opera, the Louvre, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame.
Hitler began his visit with the opera. He'd been waiting for this moment for years.
Hitler walked into the Palais Garnier through the main doors and circled the hallways as if he was familiar with the building. It was paradoxical that he was the one who gave a guided tour to the opera staff.
The Frenchmen accompanying Hitler were shocked at how much he knew about the monuments. He had always wanted to be an architect. Apparently, in the 1920s or 30s, there had been some modifications to the building, and that surprised him, since he had only ever seen the blueprints from the beginning of the century. He was always fascinated by buildings, which is why in Paris he paid such special attention to them. Long term, he wanted Berlin to surpass Paris in terms of impressive architecture.
Beneath the dome of Les Invalides is Napoleon's crypt. Hitler went there both to salute the conqueror and to prove he was superior.
The emperor's tomb was incredibly important and symbolic to Hitler. He put on a white raincoat and stood silently a moment, contemplating the crypt one last time, and then left.
It was a short visit, but the photos of Hitler's trip were seen around the globe. This symbolic footage reinforced Hitler's image as a conqueror, having seized Paris.
Hitler then flew back to Berlin.
The city was humiliated, and right away, Parisians started reacting to that.
While Hitler's trip marked the end of his initial conquest, it also indicated the start of an era of repression in France. Anti-Semitism became the norm.
Not all Frenchmen accepted the humiliation of the occupation. Many did anything they could to make things difficult for the Germans. Small yet very real acts of defiance would become the resistance.
Everything happened quickly. The people of Paris began to wonder if they really had to obey this foreign army simply because they held the keys to the city. The French state asked for good relations with the Germans. In such circumstances, was it even possible to resist?
That famous handshake between Hitler and Pétain in Montoire gave the impression that France was collaborating with the Germans.
The problem with the resistance in 1940 was that it didn't exist, at least not in an organized way. It had to be invented.
Today we tend to think of resistance from a democratic point of view, in terms of freedom, or even from a patriotic point of view, being against the idea of foreign occupation.
In daily life, the Germans and the French coexisted everywhere, in the streets, at the cafes, in the theater, or at the opera.
Every Thursday, on the steps in front of the Palais Garnier, there was a concert of German military music for the soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht, which contributed to the constant awareness of the occupying troops. This daily mixing of worlds became a problem for the French. The real big change was that mixed in with the usual Parisians was a sea of green-gray Wehrmacht uniforms, which eventually took over the auditorium of the Palais Garnier between 1940 and 1944.
They were especially noticeable on the Champs-Élysées, on the cafe terraces. But you know, it was strange because the French just acted as if they weren't there.
Albert Blazer, one of the greatest hotel managers at the time, was very strict about requiring anyone in uniform to be upstairs, meaning where no one could see them. He refused to have enemy uniforms seen in the ground floor lobby.
And at the Grand Hotel, they were cleared out under the pretext that the immense chandelier was at risk of falling.
Nazi propaganda services occasionally filmed in the streets of Paris. Yet some people would refuse to look at the camera.
The majority of the population just tolerated the situation in silence and refusal. The tension was palpable, the ambience arctic. Even the Germans referred to Paris as the blind city.
Rationing had been in effect since March 1940. Everyday life became increasingly difficult under the occupation. The Germans and the restaurants they frequented, like Maxime's, which was taken over by the Berlin restaurateur Otto Horscher, had special privileges.
When Mr. Horscher arrived, he had absolutely no intention of endangering the restaurant, and for good reason. He knew what the occupiers would want the minute they would arrive in Paris, exactly what everyone else on Earth wants, which is to eat at Maxime's.
Staying close to the Germans helped make life easier. To resist meant depriving oneself of those advantages, and the first to follow that path were few and far between. Most Frenchmen were torn between submitting, acting indifferent, or keeping their chins held high. Soon, however, acts of resistance would multiply.
If you're looking for a date it all began, I would say it was July 1940, when Jean Texier covertly published his Advice for the Occupied. The subtitle is a dignity manual, and it's all about how to act around the occupiers.
Advice for the Occupied looked like a simple typewritten piece of paper. Tongue-in-cheek, its author called for the French to maintain their distance. These are not tourists. You don't know their language, or maybe you forgot it. If one of them addresses you in German, act stupid and carry on without remorse. At its heart, Advice for the Occupied defined an independent course of action, a refusal to submit.
We needed to show that Paris would carry on. Paris would continue to live and continue to have spirit in spite of the occupiers' presence.
We never went to the theater more than we did during the war.
There had never been so many French people in the music halls, movie theaters, at concerts, and the opera.
The war produced more ethereal, poetic, and surrealistic theater pieces than ever before.
For those who resisted, it was particularly important that the Comédie Française continued its activity, that it continued to show great works and preserve the French spirit in a France that was occupied by the Germans.
In the fall of 1940, after coming to terms with the trauma of defeat, small gestures of disobedience began to multiply in Paris. It's hard to talk about the resistance as an organized act because it was often isolated gestures. It was things like people who refused to give up their seats on the metro to German officers, or who scrawled anti-German or anti-government messages on the walls.
As soon as it was dark, we would write graffiti slogans at police stations or the town hall of the 16th arrondissement, like "Down with Germany" or "Long live de Gaulle."
All of these small gestures showed that even though the Germans were the dominating power, they were not exactly welcome.
But how would the first big acts of resistance come about?
It really started with small, simple actions. People cut telephone lines installed by the Wehrmacht, which resulted in immediate and direct response. The first person apprehended was shot for cutting lines at a military facility.
Electrical outages were unpredictable, and sometimes theater performances had to be shortened or even stopped completely.
In the beginning, the Germans saw these as isolated incidents.
The seeds of resistance had been sown, and they began to take root in certain Parisian monuments.
In Paris, resistance networks began to form. They collaborated with other organizations who sprang into action around the country.
The first French network to provide intelligence to the British Secret Service was based right by the Eiffel Tower. In the heart of the Palais de Chaillot, the Groupe du Musée de l'Homme was born.
The word resist really came about with the Groupe du Musée de l'Homme in the Palais de Chaillot because the group's bulletin was named Resistance.
In the days after France's defeat, in the summer and fall of 1940, this first core group of the resistance movement was made up of one woman, Yvonne Odon, a librarian, and two Russian researchers who had recently been naturalized, Anatole Lewitsky and Boris Vilde. They worked in utmost secrecy in collaboration with the director of the Musée de l'Homme, Rivet, who was a very well-known scholar at the time.
It's important to distinguish between actions taken by the resistance and those of the networks. This network was primarily focused on helping the Allies. One could even say working for the Allies. They concentrated on providing intelligence, while other networks focused on sabotage.
Vilde had already thought about building many small paramilitary groups in preparation for a future insurrection.
These were truly shadow soldiers.
While the networks were secretly organizing, discontent started reaching the younger generation. College and high school students alike were fed up with the German presence. On November 11th, 1940, their dissatisfaction came to a head.
The students and pupils here in Paris decided to organize a protest.
Some of the young people and students just couldn't stand the presence of the Germans, and they would taunt them.
Among them was Yvan Denis. He was only in middle school, but he hated the Germans. He encouraged his peers to revolt.
In 1940, I was in the 9th grade. We were upset that protests on the French National Day were forbidden by the Germans, so we told a few people to march to the Place de l'Étoile.
A procession of several thousand students formed in the streets, many dressed in blue, white, and red as a sign of their patriotism.
We chanted and sang La Marseillaise, our national anthem. By the time we reached Place de l'Étoile, there were a lot of people, mostly young. We didn't have to wait long before we heard the sound of very loud motors, and we understood that the Germans were coming.
The marching crowd headed in the direction of the tomb of the unknown soldier and passed right by the location where many French collaborators were based. You then had militants from these factions joining the crowd, and fights began to break out. At first, the French police tried to intervene, but they were not powerful enough to get the situation under control. So towards the end of the afternoon, the Germans finally stepped in with brutal repression. It's estimated that they arrested over 100 college and high school students.
At the end of the day, we were disappointed because we couldn't protest very long. But we sang La Marseillaise at Place de l'Étoile.
That was when the Germans started to forbid protesting on days that were historically significant in French history.
In spite of it all, the flame of the unknown soldier was cared for and rekindled throughout the occupation. Hitler and Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda of Nazi Germany, wanted to create a new symbolic date, December 15th, 1940. They decided to repatriate the remains of Napoleon's son, nicknamed l'Aiglon, from Vienna to Paris. The idea was to transform the event into a commemoration of France and the Third Reich coming together.
The Germans wanted to use Les Invalides as a symbolic resting place for l'Aiglon's ashes on December 15, 1940, when they would be transferred.
Otto Abetz, the German ambassador in France, wanted the occasion to serve as a show of collaboration between the French state and Germany.
Beneath the dome of Les Invalides, in the crypt, the Germans had hung large Nazi flags in preparation for the event. An act of resistance was about to surprise them.
Many flags had been hung, but the night before the ceremony, every single one of those flags mysteriously vanished.
The event was a failure because the people of Paris refused to attend. The population demonstrated their hostility by boycotting the ceremony. Acts of resistance grew increasingly less isolated. The movement was crucial to the country, and it desperately needed more coordination.
You had resistance networks forming who were looking for resistors, and you had people who wanted to resist and who were looking for a network. But when everything is done in secrecy, and when anyone can be betrayed by anyone, it takes time to come together.
Founded by General de Gaulle, the Order of Liberation was about to help to that very end.
The Order of Liberation is a former order founded by General de Gaulle to reward the men, women, groups and cities that most resisted, particularly those who resisted quickly.
The Order of Liberation was quickly created by General de Gaulle on November 16, 1940. Why did he create it? Well, he was one man with only 3,000 supporters. He realized he needed to reward those who had stood by his side since the beginning, while also attracting new volunteers to join their cause. And, above all, he needed a way to affirm his own sovereign powers. By creating the Order of Liberation, he was essentially challenging Marshal Pétain. It was the Legion of Honor of a free France, and it was a fight for legitimacy.
Over 10% of the members of the Order of Liberation were from Paris, which would pay a heavy price for resistance. Among its heroes were Jean Cavaillès from the Confrérie Notre-Dame, Honoré d'Estienne-d'Orve, the first martyr of Free France, Jean Moulin and Pierre Brossolette. Honoré d'Estienne d'Orve arrived in France in December 1940 with one mission: build an intelligence network around maritime operations. He came to Paris to find supporters.
When he came to Paris, he needed to build connections within the administration and the police force in order to get this information, which was crucial to both the Free France and the British.
Betrayed by his radio operator, who was a German spy, d'Estienne d'Orve was arrested in January 1941 and executed by the Germans. Pierre Brossolette, another spearhead of the resistance, also came to Paris.
Brossolette was a journalist who was well known for his socialist pacifism before the war. During the war, he quickly became resistant.
He couldn't accept the occupation of his country, and he quickly decided to buy a bookstore in the 16th arrondissement. The store's address was 89 Rue de la Pompe, and would serve as the perfect front for organizing resistance meetings. The store made it easy for random people to look like clients. It also had a rotating bookshelf, which allowed them to discreetly hold secret meetings in the back of the store.
Paris was a major hub for the dissemination of intelligence. But intelligence was only useful to the Allies if it was transmitted. The Confrérie Notre-Dame was one of the largest resistance networks. It was one of the first and one of the most powerful because it had radio connections with London, so most of the other network's transmissions went through the Confrérie Notre-Dame. It was at the center of it all. One of the problems with the networks was that they were often spontaneously created. But without a contact with London, they were useless. If they had information they couldn't share, there was no point. Here, they could share information through the French state, through Switzerland with the American Secret Service, the OSS, or they could do what everyone else was doing, attempt to contact London through de Gaulle and the Central Bureau of Intelligence and Operations, known as BCRA.
Resistance fighters were more than just spies. They also sought to engage the public and build up hope for the people of France. But how could they prove their point without taking too many risks? A symbol drawn over all the walls of Paris would help, the V for victory.
The famous V campaign was started by the British and was a call for the French to write V's all over as a symbol of hope for the Allied victory.
Metro tickets were folded into V's. Among other gestures, one could use to show one's refusal to accept the German occupation.
The German authorities took notice and even tried to take advantage, using Paris's most famous monuments.
The Germans installed enormous V's on the Eiffel Tower and in the Chamber of Deputies, hoping to change the meaning of that symbol.
Goebbels was worried, so he put a V on the pediment of the National Assembly with the phrase, "Germany shall be victorious on all fronts."
Goebbels' campaign was a failure. To Parisians, the V remained a symbol of the resistance. Patriots everywhere began to mobilize.
That's when even actors at the Comédie Française decided to join the resistance.
I think there are two key resistance fighters that each served different causes. On one hand, there was Pierre Dux, who was a Gaullist, and then there was Julien Berthaud, who was a communist. As 1941 came to a close, it was Julien Berthaud who asked Pierre Dux to join a movement called the Front National du Théâtre, which was of communist persuasion. And Dux, even though he was a Gaullist, accepted the offer. Together, the two of them were partners who wrote articles for clandestine French publications. They also edited a series of leaflets that were apparently placed in the lockers of the actors and theatre staff.
If we were to identify opera locations that were key to the resistance, the main place was certainly the stagehand's locker room at the Palais Garnier. That's where decisions were made and where the typewriter was kept, despite the fact that it was totally forbidden to use things like a typewriter. And that's also where people felt free to speak safely without being overheard.
It was here at the Comédie Française that Paul Claudel's The Satin Slipper was created. The play was a success for both German and French audiences. It was directed by Jean-Louis Barrault, and the two lead characters were played by Marie Belle and Madeleine Renaud.
The satin slipper was one of the most emblematic creations to come out of the Comédie Française during that period. It was a completely insane idea. The play was so long that just attempting to produce it was a challenge in and of itself.
Pierre Barrier was a young playwright and student when he saw the satin slipper at the Comédie Française. He still remembers.
They trimmed it down a lot. The original play was 7 hours, but they cut it to 4, which was still very long. Guitry said, "Thank God it's not a double feature."
Since the beginning of the war, the theatre's opening hours were moved up so that spectators taking the metro wouldn't miss their train. Considering the Germans were there, it felt like a triumph. Certain lines also had extra importance. For example, "Set the captives free," which clearly resonated with the audience.
To fight the resistance and its networks, the Germans increased their police and counterintelligence forces. The Gestapo patrolled every Parisian arrondissement. German law enforcement increased throughout the capital. Hitler's security units were tasked with fighting back against the resistance while also tracking down the Jews. In addition to the Wehrmacht army, there was the Feldgendarmerie, the Secret Service, the political police, the security police, the SS security service, the French Gestapo, and the German Gestapo.
It was here between number 80 and 84 on Avenue Foch, just a few steps from the Arc de Triomphe, that the German Gestapo set up headquarters.
In the beginning, the French resistance was made up of amateurs, and they were face-to-face with professionals. It was relatively easy for the Germans to infiltrate the various networks that started popping up. It was easy for them to neutralize these networks. Shutting them down was fairly simple to the German forces.
The moment Germany went to war with the USSR and ended the German-Soviet pact was a major turning point for the French resistance.
June 21, 1941, Hitler attacked the USSR and revived the Communist Party's pre-war anti-fascism. The Communist Party developed an urban guerrilla strategy. The goal was to show the Germans that they were not safe in France. A few dozen combatants prepared for action. Their leader was Pierre Georges, the future Colonel Fabian, a worker who was a longtime activist for the Communist Party. He had fought in the Spanish Civil War and was experienced with weapons and active combat. Pierre Georges was the first to spring into action in August 1941, in Paris's first attack in the Barbès-Rochechouart metro station, where Pierre Georges killed a midshipman.
Alphonse Moser was a Marine employee. It was in that moment that his two killers thought they may have actually eliminated someone important. Unfortunately, Marine uniforms were easy to spot, and Moser was not an admiral, he was a simple soldier. That's when Hitler decided to kill 100 of his hostages, which happened at the end of October 1941.
The attack on Moser took place near Montmartre and the Sacré-Cœur. From then on, tensions in the streets of Paris rose considerably. A feeling of suspicion was constant among the occupying forces.
The first attacks organized in the summer of 1941 did not go over well with the general population because they provoked German retaliation. But as the idea of freedom became increasingly possible, the rumors of Allied forces landing on the French coast, the urban guerrilla strategy, suddenly seemed like a good, even justifiable approach.
The German repression of young communists played out in one of the most symbolic spaces of the capital, the Palais Bourbon, former headquarters of the Chamber of Deputies. The Germans transformed it into a courthouse where they tried and sentenced 7 communist militants in March. The following month, another trial took place at the Maison de la Chimie. This time, 27 people were facing trial, some of them very young. André Kirchen was the youngest at just 15 years old, and he escaped the death penalty thanks to his age, but was sent to prison in Germany. 25 of his co-defendants never denied a thing and were sentenced to death. Another event shocked Paris and drove further commitment to the resistance. the roundup and deportation of the Jews at the Veldiv.
July the 16th, 1942 was both a major blow and a turning point. The roundup was horrible because these people were raided in the early morning and taken away in atrocious conditions. First, they were sent to the Velodrome d'Hiver, which was terrible enough. Then to the Drancy internment camp. That's when people really understood that they were under the control of a regime that planned to exterminate the Jews. They realized what was really going on.
The resistance urgently needed to come together.
In 1942, General de Gaulle realized something was going on and that it was time to switch from the idea of a free France to a fighting France. That meant uniting both internal and external resistance forces.
The essential task would be carried out by Jean Moulin, sent in from London by General de Gaulle. He was based in Lyon, but it was in Paris that he would rewrite history.
The leaders of the networks and the resistance set up a meeting in Paris to coordinate their next steps. Paris became the capital of the resistance.
On May 27, 1943, under the leadership of Jean Moulin, the first meeting of the National Council of the Resistance was held on Rue du Fort in Paris.
None of the spy networks were invited to this meeting. Only resistance representatives from the entire political spectrum were present.
Organizing a secret meeting for 16 of the strongest resistance fighters of the time, all of whom were actively being hunted by the Gestapo in the heart of the occupied zone, was extremely complicated. Jean Moulin found an apartment that had a mezzanine. There was a way for one to leave the apartment from the kitchen, which led through an inner courtyard, which would eventually allow people to escape if the people came to search the building. It was also a vast high-end apartment with a dining room that was perfect for organizing a meeting that wouldn't be overheard by any neighbors. The meeting lasted about 2 hours. Jean Moulin left the meeting with a radiant smile because he knew that by the end of it, he'd achieved two key objectives: unite the resistance and ensure all the resistance leaders would recognize General de Gaulle's authority. As of 1943, Paris would become an indispensable part of the resistance movement.
These unified resistance networks greatly contributed to saving the lives of English and American pilots that were shot down over French territory. Thanks to the anonymity that Paris provided, they were able to be redirected to other destinations. The great Parisian monuments also played an important role.
Les Invalides, a great palace in the center of Paris, is known for its dome that cuts through the city skyline. An essential part of the Parisian resistance would take place here.
Les Invalides was run by the French state, which was collaborating with the Germans. Wehrmacht soldiers had been garrisoned there since 1940 and worked as staff. Yet somehow, a group of resistance would find a way to sneak past them.
Georges Morin lived here in a small house on the street side of Les Invalides with his wife and his daughter Yvette. He received radio posts and distributed underground media. Starting in 1942, he put a program in place to take in American, British, and Canadian pilots who had been shot down over French territory. He took them into his home, organized counterfeit documents, and arranged safe passage for them to Spain through the resistance, where they would then continue to England or the United States. Mrs. Morin would take them to the roof of the dome where they couldn't be seen by the Germans. They were completely protected there. Some even took advantage of the situation to leave a little graffiti behind as a reminder that they had been there on behalf of France.
At the base of the dome at Les Invalides, not far from the Eiffel Tower, American and British airmen walked these rooftops protected by the Morins. When they needed to hide, they used this small door to take shelter beneath the roof.
The Morins' adventure would end tragically on June 5, 1944, when they were arrested by the Gestapo at 6 in the morning. They were imprisoned and interrogated. Georges Morin was deported and died in December 1944. His wife and daughter were also deported, but would be freed during the liberation of the camps.
More than 130 aviators were saved by Georges Morin, his family, and their network. They were incredibly brave, all the more so because as of 1942, they lived in constant fear of bombings, which destroyed nearby suburbs like Boulogne-Billancourt. High school students at Janson de Sailly learned to live with the same danger.
Students were sent into the basements at Janson de Sailly High School during bombings. As classes got mixed, some took advantage of the situation to promote the resistance.
We were sent into the basement, and so we used that time to spread the word. It was an opportunity to meet lots of other people that were not in your usual class or in your grade. There were philosophy students, math students, and juniors, while we were in the 9th grade. It gave us all a chance to talk.
Janson de Sailly students were dramatically affected by rationing and by the presence of German troops, causing many to join the resistance.
Faced with a growing resistance, the Germans doubled down on repression. The Gestapo and the police took down multiple networks and their leaders. The battle intensified.
The second big attack was perhaps the most symbolic, because it was targeting a leading figure. It was August 1943, and the mark was Julius Ritter, Sauckel's representative in France. The Germans were incredibly unpopular due to the compulsory work service law. Sauckel was known as Hitler's slave driver. Julius Ritter was killed in a raid.
It was now 1943, and the resistance was really evolving and becoming more and more of a threat. That is why the Germans invested heavily in any investigation that attempted to infiltrate the different resistance networks.
There was a special unit that was tasked with setting up real fake resistance networks, meaning the Germans or people working for the Germans would assist the other networks, and that's how they infiltrated them. The purpose of this unit was not to take down the organizations right away, but to infiltrate them, to rise to the top, and to become familiar with their activities. They could then leak fake intel to the Allies.
The efficiency of this approach cost Pierre Brossolette his life. On March 22, 1944, he was randomly stopped. Unfortunately, the Germans had his picture and recognized him.
Between 80 and 84 on Avenue Foch, Pierre Brossolette was detained, tortured, and eventually killed.
How would the landing on June 6, 1944 be a game changer? Parisian resistance fighters gained confidence. They targeted the voice of the French state, Philippe Henriot.
Et c'est vous qui nous dites que nous ne sommes pas des patriotes, vous qui avez tellement perdu la foi dans votre patrie que vous ne comptez plus que sur l'étranger pour lui rapporter ce qu'elle a perdu.
In 1944, Philippe Henriot was Secretary of State for Information and Propaganda. His voice was heard on radios everywhere, and the resistance considered him to be extremely dangerous. They decided to kill him.
On June 28, 1944, he was assassinated in his official apartment on Rue de Solferino by a group of resistance fighters. The French state organized a national funeral at City Hall and Notre-Dame de Paris. Tens of thousands of Parisians attended. By using Paris's great monuments for the ceremony, the French state hoped it would go down in history.
In Paris, Notre-Dame was seen as a symbol of collaboration under the occupation, notably because of Cardinal Suard. Cardinal Suard was anti-communist and anti-Gaullist, and he denounced all resistance activities as acts of terrorism. He was the one who called for a nationwide homage to honor Philippe Henriot following his assassination.
When the great voice of the collaboration was silenced, it signified something for all collaborators. They understood that their time had come, that it was over for them.
The resistance swelled with new recruits. How would they be equipped? How could they help bring about liberation? And how could they arrange a massive Parisian uprising?
Starting in August 1944, with a liberation just around the corner, it became difficult to find enough arms for resistance fighters. Young resistance thought they had a reliable lead, found through two agents who actually worked for the Germans. They promised them guns. They set up a meeting on August 16, 1944. These young resistance fighters got in their trucks, only to realize they'd actually been set up by Gestapo agents.
After being brutally tortured, the young fighters were brought here in the heart of the Bois de Boulogne, not far from this waterfall. Shots rang out at dawn. They were all shot down, as these bullet holes in this tree can attest. 35 bodies were found. Those young resistance fighters paid with their lives for trying to serve their country. None of them would see the liberation, although the time was near.
Despite this massacre, the resistance decided to amplify the armed conflict. The Parisian uprising was proof that the people no longer tolerated the Germans and were ready to help the Allies at any cost.
The Paris Uprising changed everything. It allowed resistance fighters to emerge from the shadows. Blue, white, and red flags now hung from major monuments.
The Paris Uprising really began with the railway workers. The railway workers stopped all the trains and everyone went on strike. Everyone else came out of hiding and the resistance movement gained a lot of power and traction. It was precisely because the people rose up that the enemy retreated.
This downtrodden country had successfully rebuilt its legend, that of a Paris that rose up, like in 1830, 1848, the 1871 Paris Commune, and so on. Paris was once again the capital of France and the city of light.
During the occupation, police headquarters were a symbol of Nazi collaboration. But it also became a symbol of Paris's liberation, because on August 19, 1944, the police were the first to revolt. That uprising marked the beginning of the fight that would mobilize all of Paris to fight for freedom.
Intelligence networks played a huge part in the liberation of Paris because telephones were still working. So they were able to relay a lot of information, particularly about troop movements.
During the rebel strike that last week of August in 1944, calls were regularly made, and we know exactly who made those calls. And when you cross-check those lists with the lists of personnel who are active in the resistance, it's a perfect match. That's how we know that there were drivers, but also musicians who were part of the Sniper Battalion, and other supporters who fought for freedom in Paris's 9th arrondissement.
During the liberation, the Comédie Française took on a new role, which would re-establish the prestige of this institution.
The Comédie Française primarily contributed to the liberation by acting as an advanced outpost for the Red Cross. It became a makeshift hospital. And we have photos of actors wearing red armbands, acting as improvised nurses to help the wounded, that passed through the Comédie Française before being sent to the Hôtel Dieu de Paris hospital.
How would the Germans react in the face of mounting pressure from the Paris uprisings? Could they still hold Paris captive, or would they turn to the scorched earth policy and attempt to destroy the city's greatest monuments?
Paris was thought of as a fortress. The moment the Allied troops started to move in, they had to be stopped.
Hitler certainly wanted to destroy the Eiffel Tower in 1944. It was the perfect symbol. Some bridges were also on the list, but their destruction would have been more strategic.
Dietrich von Choltitz was in charge of the mission. He had only 20,000 troops on the ground. And of that 20,000, half were men in military administrative positions, not soldiers. His most important duty was to maintain their hold on strategic areas. If Hitler had blown up the bridges at that time, he would have sabotaged his own defenses. But he never intended to destroy Notre-Dame or any other buildings.
After 1,531 days of domination, the Germans gave up the fight, and on August 25th, General Leclerc and the Americans secured von Scholitz's surrender.
De Gaulle really wanted the French to liberate Paris by themselves and to have General Leclerc be the first to step foot in a free Paris.
General de Gaulle's arrival in Paris was triumphant. On August the 26th, he went down the Champs-Élysées from the Arc de Triomphe. A jubilant crowd cheered him on. Smiling faces were a stark contrast to those of June 1940. There was an air of celebration, although the war continued.
Paris, Paris outragé, Paris brisé, Paris martyrisé, mais Paris libéré. Libéré par lui-même, libéré par son peuple avec le concours des armées de la France, avec l'appui et le concours de la France tout entière, c'est-à-dire de la France qui se bat, c'est-à-dire de la seule France, de la vraie France, de la France éternelle.
Those words made Paris an allegory for all of France, of a France that fights, of the only France. That is the France de Gaulle wanted the world to remember.
A new sort of prestige returned to the capital's monuments. Notre-Dame, once a place of tribute for Henriot, became a place of honor for General de Gaulle. He went there for a Te Deum and sat on the seat of the President of the Republic, especially prepared for the occasion. When he exited, a shooting broke out, but de Gaulle did not falter.
He was careful and made sure that Cardinal Suard was not present in the cathedral at that moment. And while there were a few isolated shots, we never found out if it was militiamen or lone German shooters.
It became known as the Te Deum under fire.
The end of the war was strange, because the Germans left even faster than they came. One morning, they were gone.
The liberation also meant settling the score for those who had betrayed France and the Parisian capital. Even the great monuments needed to be cleansed.
All the various cultural institutions had a problem. They needed to be cleaned out quickly, in the heat of the moment.
When one speaks of collaboration, I would say that all of France collaborated, but that obviously was done in different ways.
They couldn't just carry on as if nothing had happened, even though they would have liked to. During the summer of 1944, everyone wished they could treat the entire thing as a parenthesis, and that there were only a handful of traitors. In reality, it went much deeper. It was much more serious than that.
Hotel Lutetia was emblematic because that was the place where all the camp survivors were gathered. And for weeks on end, families came to the hotel, desperately hoping to find a lost sister, mother, or brother. That was another powerful moment for Paris.
The magic of Paris was back in full force. Although the Eiffel Tower's elevators had not been in service since June 1940, they miraculously started running again. At Maxime's, Monsieur Albert, the maître d', was arrested, but quickly released. And Orcher returned the restaurant to its owners as promised.
The motto of Paris, Flutac nec mergitur, she is tossed by the waves but does not sink, is exactly what happened during the German occupation.
Paris is the true symbol of the resistance and the liberation, because it's the French capital and its actions that were of capital importance.
By occupying Paris and flying the swastika from all of its greatest monuments, Hitler thought he would humiliate France, but he was wrong. Paris was free and had regained its shine after having been the capital of the resistance.